Hello and welcome to a very windy linear fisheries, and in this short video I'm going to be running through probably my most asked question on social media and when I'm on the bank, and that is how far do you clip your fishing rods up in comparison to your spod rod, and not only that, what bait do you use when fishing in really strong wind conditions. And as you can see, we've already got off to a flying start, so without further ado I'm going to slip this one back and I'm going to run through exactly what I do to keep the bites coming when the wind picks up. Now, when it comes to fishing in strong winds, there's a couple of things that you can do to ensure that you carry on fishing as accurately as possible. And the first things first, if you're using any form of, I've got a bite, can you hear that going? So despite the very strong crosswind, getting bait out there and getting the rods back out there, bang on the money every time, is certainly keeping the bites coming. Now, there probably isn't a more awkward wind to fish in than a crosswind. Not only have you got to compete with the bow, but you've also got to adjust how far you're clipping the rods up, which is something that I'm going to go over when hopefully I get this fishing. But yeah, the wind is proper savage coming down from right to left, so I've got undertow to compete with as well. I'm just keeping the rod nice and low. I predominantly playing with the tip quite low anyway, but when you've got a crosswind like this, the last thing you want to be doing is playing with the rod in the air, and you end up fighting the wind more than what you do the fish. So I'm keeping the rod nice and low. I'm just slowly playing him in, and hopefully we can get another linear fisheries carp in the net. Prior to clipping your rods up, you've obviously got to find a spot. Now, no matter how many videos I've done on this, how many people I speak to, the biggest mistake I see people consistently doing is turning up and trying to fish as far as they possibly can. Now, the weather, as you will all know, living in England, can change at the drop of a hat. 1 minute it can be nice and calm and you can be chilled out. The next minute you can be tucked up in your bivvy with gale force winds. The last thing that you want to be doing is finding a spot that you can only fish for part of your session. Now, as I was saying, it is something that I see so many people making a mistake. It isn't about turning up to a lake and trying to compete with the guys either side. It's about turning up to the lake, getting yourself a swim and fishing and doing as best as you possibly can. And the last thing you want to be doing is finding a spot, being able to fish it nice and accurately for the first sort of 12-18 hours of your session, having a couple of fish, only to find that the following day the wind's going to change. Now, we all know that the last day, the third night, whatever, fishing over the baited area can be the most prolific, and the last thing that you want to be doing is being sat behind 3 rods thinking, you know what, if I'd have fished a little bit shorter, I could have maintained the consistency on that spot and I'd have been catching all the way throughout the trip. So that is the biggest thing. Don't fish too far out, fish somewhere that you can hit irrespective of the conditions, and the bobbins will keep on bouncing. So when it comes to actually clipping up your fishing rods in comparison to your spod rod, how far should you leave between your spod and your fishing rod? Now, my general rule is if I'm fishing in anything from 12 foot of water or shallower, everything gets clipped up the same. Anything over 12 foot, I'll allow just a couple of extra feet on my fishing rods just to compensate for the swing back. Now, there is so many different variables and there's so many different answers to this question. Obviously, I don't know what your setup is, whether you spawn with braid, spawn with mono, if you're fishing with braid, if you're fishing with mono, what pound of breaking strain you're using, what manufacturer you're using, what size of lead you're using. So I can only go by like myself as an example. Now, I fish with mono and I spawn with braid. So today, very strong crosswind. I'm fishing in about 10 or 11 feet of water. Normally, everything would be clipped up the same, but with the wind, I've actually clipped my spawn a rod length further than what I'm fishing with my rods. Now the reason for that is when I'm chucking the spom out, it's hitting the clip, there's no stretch. So the spom isn't taking any stretch out of the line at all, it's braid. So if the spom hits the clip up in the air, it's not going to stretch out. All it's going to do is it's going to pull round on the wind. So in my head, I've sort of compensated for, it's going to sound mad, but I sort of look at the horizon tree line and how far round the bow goes. I sort of work out roughly how far that is to my spot and then let the line out accordingly. Now I'm fishing with mono. I've got a 4-ounce head, so I've got a nice big lead on there, and the mono that I'm using is 16 pound. It's a relatively low stretch mono, but with how hard I'm hitting the clip, you're still going to have that little bit of stretch. But like I say, it's all dependent on, you know, on your personal setup. Obviously if you're spomming with mono, you're going to be hitting the spom a lot harder, therefore it's going to be taking a lot more of the stretch out the line, which means therefore it's going to be traveling a bit further. But it's all, you know, it's all session dependent. It's a very, very hard one to explain, and like I say, it's a question that I get asked a lot, but without knowing the situation that the person's in, the setup that they're using, the rule that I go to is if I'm fishing 12 feet of water or less, everything's clipped up the same. Anything over, I'll allow a couple more feet on the rods just to allow for the swing back. And then when it comes to the wind, like I've got here today, I'm fishing a rod length past, and the reason, like I say, for that is because that's roughly how far I feel the bow in the line's going. Obviously, as the wind changes, then it's something that you have to sort of readjust. But until you're actually in a situation where you've got a real strong crosswind like I have today, it's very, very hard to gauge. But like I say, as a general rule, anything under 12 foot, clip everything the same. So once you've located the spot and you've clipped the rods up, then on to mixing up your bait. Now, like a lot of videos that I do and a lot of the fishing that I do, the bait that I'll usually go when I'm fishing in a lot calmer conditions will usually consist mulched up boilies, hemp, sweet corn, bloodworm, and where allowed, maggots. But on a day like today, that mix will be completely irrelevant. All I'll be doing is putting it out there, and it'll be drifting off and floating off either into someone else's peg, or it'll be baiting around the spot that I found. So making the right mix is absolutely paramount. So the mix that I've got here, very, very basic. Like the base of all my spod mixes, hemp, I've got sweet corn, I've got maize, tiger nuts, as well as whole 12mm boil as well. It's a nice heavy mix that I know when that spom hits the water, it's going to sink down and it's going to land exactly where I want the bait to land. A couple of other things worth mentioning as well is once the mix is made, topping the bucket up with lake water. Now you want the lake water to sit just above the mix, and what this does is it keeps everything in the mix nice and hydrated, therefore making the mix a lot heavier, so when you're spomming it out, it's going down a lot faster. And one thing that you don't want to be doing is adding any pellets or ground bait to this mix. All that's going to do is going to dry everything out, it's going to make it extremely light, and then when you're spomming it out there, the wind and the tow is going to catch hold of it and it's going to be drifting. So on a nice heavy bucket of bait, keep it hydrated, and when you're putting it out there, it's going on the same spot every single time. Right, now I'm just about to chuck out, and this is also very, very important that when you're casting, to try and correct the line as much as you can before the lead has actually hit the clip. The wind's coming from right to left, so when I make this cast in a second, I'm going to hold the tip at a 45-degree angle upwind, so it's correcting the line as best as possible. If you've got the tip in the air or facing over towards which way the line's coming out, you're going to end up with a massive, massive bow, and it's just going to affect your presentation in your line lay and trying to bring your line back around when you eventually clip the bobbin on and try and settle your line so it points back straight to where your lead's going. So this is all clipped up. I know where I'm aiming. Again, another thing worth mentioning, you're not going to be aiming directly at the spot that you initially found. You're going to be aiming either left or right, depending on what way the wind's going. I'm aiming, well, you can't see this, but I'm aiming 2 trees to the right of where my spot is, on the hope that when it hits the clip, it comes round on a tight line and lands bang on. So make sure the clutch is done up, a nice steady cast, and as soon as I let it go, the rod is going to be at a 45-degree angle up to the right mending the bow. On the clip, tip down, donk. And already that line is probably 50% better than what it would be if I had the rod aiming anywhere else. So that's bang on. I'm going to put that down, a couple more spoms over the top, and fingers crossed another bite's going to be on the cards. How about that then, to finish what has been a rather blustery but very productive day. This is now carp number 8 and the second 30 of the day as well. And thankfully the wind has now died down. So all that's left for me to do is to get this fish back. I'm going to bring the 3 rods in that I've got out there and just make sure that now the wind's died down, everything is clipped up 100% perfect. There's no need to add anything on. They're all ready to go and fish on the original spot and the distance that I found. But what a brilliant, brilliant day's fishing it's been. Regardless of the wind, chop and change, add a little bit on, and if it's not happening, make it happen.